Now we've established colonial America at that time. Let's now compare the French Revolution. Two roughly simultaneous revolutions. Which would you bet on? Well, actually, the American Revolution was conceived and executed by a poor, isolated group, those colonists over there across the pond, composed of Christian religious fanatics, backwoods, self-educated people with few monetary or capital resources. Does anybody hear the echo of bitter clingers? Maybe. Compare that to the French Revolution, the wealthiest nation on the planet at the time, with the best educated leaders of Europe, emancipated from biblical Christianity only a century earlier. To a secularist, this really was the recipe for success. If you placed your bet on France, some would say you're playing it safe. The richest, most powerful nation of Europe at the beginning of the 18th century had begun a century earlier to forego every aspect of its culture that brought it to that point. As you recall, the divine right kings, Catherine de' Medici, with her son Charles, set to murder and exile Puritan believers and sought to keep the masses ignorant just as the previous sovereigns had done. The result set the stage of the demise of everything men hold dear. But it didn't start out that way. It started off actually with the best of intentions. See, the revolution of reason was to succeed where the influences of Plato and Aristotle had failed, freeing human nature from its brutal propensity to murder, thieve, and enslave. It was to overcome that fatal temptation of power and its corruption by throwing off the traditional mantle of morality, piety, and virtue, opening all precepts up for debate and replacing all norms with the power of human reason. But in reality, it's the story of a people who rebelled against morality of scriptural providence, to realize too late that the alliance would cost them their health, wealth, and even life. No lesson could be more clear. I call this the grand, glorious, epic tale of two revolutions, or How to Kill a Nation in 13 Easy Steps. Let's take a look. The start of the French Revolution, in some respects, was a very predictable course of events. After all, divine right kings were being dismantled all across Europe. There were calls for open revolution in the Americas, Ireland, Scotland, even England itself. Change was in the air. But for France, there was no voice of Christian morality. France did not have someone like Edmund Burke, like England did, whose book Reflections on the French Revolution, by some historians, claims single-handedly saved England from the same fate we're about to look at. Hence now, the 13 how-to principles of the revolution went unchallenged. First, silence Christian influence. This is where we start a revolution. The first step is to silence biblical Christian influence. And in this case, it had already been done. Out of revenge for deposing the de' Medici papacy, persecutions were initiated by the new queen. And thus started 100 years of maniacal persecution of the Huguenots, culminating in the capture, torture, violent murder, and expulsion of every Huguenot man, woman, and child the government could find, an estimated 1/3 of the French population. Some of you are probably going, Huguenots? Huguenots? Who are the Huguenots? And here I am to tell you that the Huguenots are actually the Victor Hugo fan club of Des Moines. And you're not buying it. Darn. Although, a great author. Pick up his books. They're really fantastic. He has a very deep insight into human nature. One of my favorite quotes. Have courage for the great sorrows of life, patience for the small ones. And when you have laboriously accomplished your daily task, go to sleep in peace. God is awake. I love it. But the real Huguenots were the Protestant reformers influenced by John Calvin. They're the French Puritans, if you will, composed of aristocracy and the merchant class, artisans and craftsmen. And to silence that Christian influence, during the persecution, Louis XIV first sent missionaries to convert them, along with financial rewards. Then he got a little tougher and imposed penalties. Then he closed their schools, excluded them from certain professions. Compare this to today. Like the mayor of Houston, excluding Christians from being part of the city board. Escalating, he tried forcibly to convert the Huguenots by armed dragonnades, soldiers who would occupy and loot their homes. In 1685, Louis removed religious liberties altogether, revoking the Edict of Nantes and declaring Protestantism to be illegal by the Edict of Fontainebleau. Persecutions eventually included the execution of Huguenot ministers, wives, children, dispatch of laymen to the galleys, and even desecration of the dead. Duc de Saint-Simon in his diaries declared, without the least pretext or any necessity, depopulated a quarter of the kingdom, estimated 400,000 by some historians, ruined its commerce, and weakened it in all parts, just so that she could get back at the reformers. And now it's time for a well-deserved dandelion break. You think so, or do you want to go on?
Keep going.
Good going. I love it. All right. Well, number 2, what do you think the next step is? You've taken away Christian influence. Now what? Fill it with something. Once the voice of the tenets of Christianity are silenced, it becomes easy to fill the void. To a secularist, it doesn't even matter what to fill it with. Remember, men have a propensity for bondage, any bondage. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the philosophical intellectual leader of the French Revolution, was pure Plato-humanism at its core. He did not believe in the sinful nature of man, but rather spoke of, get this, the noble savage. The noble savage was the expression of the true man, unhindered by cultural precepts, which was much to blame for society. This perverted, fantastical view of mankind elevated the savages, which Rousseau claimed were the noblest and happiest. Even though it was the savages, of course, who were the ones murdering, skinning, and cannibalizing each other. But that was just a minor detail to Rousseau. So he sets out to destroy Christian cultural precepts. How do you do that? Rule number 3, start at the top with the intelligentsia. And intellectualism, throw everything out for analysis. Beauty, love, color, gender, authority, dirty socks, everything. Rehash of Plato and Socrates. All to conclude that if morals are only the material constructs of perception, then no moral constraints exist. Does that sound familiar from episode 1?
Yes. Yep.
Yes.
It should. After all, if man is good, then I don't need the evil church to restrict us from just being ourselves. And an uneducated public could not see the partial truth. That is, to show, I'm going to get better with this, to throw off enslavement. You can tell I get really excited about this. To throw off enslavement was to overthrow the influence of the corrupt Roman Catholic influence. But at the same time, not realizing there is a difference between man-made religious doctrines and the genuine scriptural precepts. Therefore, the sense that I don't need a God prevailed. And in this reasoning, Rousseau considers himself to be one of the greatest men of history. And by the way, he writes several books to defend that title. But he's a hypocrite. He too talked about man's great natural virtues. Think about that for you moms and dads out there. Man's natural virtues. Okay, seriously, how many mom and dads are out there who know their children to be golden angels without sin nature from birth? Raise your hands. 1, 2, 3. Oh, man. Yeah, none. We know better, right? Therefore, because of the importance of his work and the fact that mankind is good and we don't need role model supervision, he reasoned, get this, to abandon his 5 children, born out of wedlock, of course, and left them in the public hospitals to be raised. He justifies his action this way.
Plato advocated this. Hence, what I did was good and sensible arrangement. The children would be all the better for not being delicately reared, since it would make them more robust. They would be happier than with their father. I could have wished that I would have been raised that way. If only I could have had that same good fortune. I thought I was performing the act of a citizen and a father, and I looked upon myself as a member of Plato's Republic. Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
The twisted humanist culture behind America's schools and academic institutions is taking its predictable course. The corruption and demise of America's academic institutions is actually eerily reminiscent of the pseudo-intellectualism behind the French Revolution. But I'll leave that for you to decide in our next installment, The Curse of the Pseudo-Intelligentsia. Next time, right here, on A Heritage Lost, The American Truth.